welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit Projections online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. In the 19th century, we worked 100 hours a week over the course of 6 to 6.5 days. In the 20th century, that work week shifted to 40 hours over 5 days. But today, 77% of Americans work more than 40 hours a week, and that's a pre-pandemic statistic. At the time of this recording, there's legislation calling for a reduction in standard workweek hours from 40 hours down to 32, and that's been introduced in Congress, but whether or not that bill gains traction is anyone's guess. My guest today, however, is a firm believer in the power of a 4-day workweek. Andrew Barnes is the founder of Perpetual Guardian. He's the architect for 4-Day Week Global, a not-for-profit community designed to provide a platform for those interested in supporting the idea of the 4-day week as part of the future of work. Andrew is also the author of The 4-Day Week, How the Flexible Work Revolution Can Increase Productivity, Profitability, and Wellbeing and Help Create a Sustainable Future. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today on Project HR.
Hi, Jen. How are you?
Good. Now, Andrew, you've had a remarkable career well outside of advocating for the 4-day work week. Can you share a little bit about your background with me and how that might have set the stage for your current efforts?
Well, yeah, look, I'd like to apologize up front. I used to be an investment banker. And I think in many ways, that's the thing that has led me to the way we've started to model work in my business. And that's because I think right from the get-go, I started my career in the City of London. We were trying to out-American the Americans. We were working 12-hour days. In that time, I had 2 people have nervous breakdowns in front of me.
Wow.
And I knew that the way I worked was unhealthy. But of course, the financial rewards were incredibly high. And if you get to the top of the tree or close to the top of the tree in investment banking, you're sort of making the money. It's the people down the line that often have the worst combination of decent wages, yes, but actually horrific hours. You may have seen things, about Goldman Sachs talking about 90-hour weeks for some of its junior staff. And I got to this epiphany point really when I'd moved to Australia. I was also working for investment banks there. And I decided that actually I hated what I was doing and I hated my life. And I moved out of that sphere into initially wealth management and then into these trust businesses. And I decided at that point that I was actually going to try and find a model that was different to the way I had worked prior to that point, but also importantly, different for the people who worked for me.
So then along came this report in The Economist, and it changed your life. Tell me about that report and your reaction to it.
Well, yeah, look, I was sitting on a plane. Remember planes? We used to fly on.
Yes.
And I was reading an Economist report on productivity. And what it said was the Brits were productive for 2.5 hours a day and the Canadians for 1.5 hours a day. Now, that's not working. They were clearly working the full 8 hours. But what it was talking about is the way in which they were delivering productivity was not very efficient. And I wondered, was that happening in my company? And then I wondered, if I changed the way the work week was constructed, would I see changes in behavior, changes in process, so that we would maintain the productivity whilst working less time? And it was that all I wanted to do was test that experiment, see whether in fact we could maintain productivity, but by working less hours.
Interesting. So tell me about this 180-100 rule.
Well, that's actually evolved after the trial. So what we did is right from the get-go, we thought, look, I went to my head of HR. I said, let's try this. So it didn't look very well when I said I was going to launch a 4-day week because of all the implications that drop off it. But we ran this trial to test the assumption. And the thesis we had was that we want 100% of pay, that's normal 5 days, 80% of time,
Hmm.
provided we get 100% productivity. So the
Okay.
deal is always about the same level as pay and the same level of productivity, but less time. There are
Mm.
lots of other models out there, but this is the one that we wanted to test, and this is the one that we think is fair.
And I really appreciate that you used your own company as the testing grounds for this. Can you tell us about how it went internally?
Well, the trial went incredibly well. I mean, we ran it back in 2018. We ran it for 3 months. What we found was that our engagement scores, so those are the engagement, empowerment, enrichment, enthusiasm scores from staff, they went up 40%, 40%,
Hmm.
to the levels that researchers that were doing it for us said were the highest levels they'd ever seen in New Zealand. Stress levels dropped 15%. More people said they were better able to do their job working 4 days rather than five.
Hmm.
And we found that overall output and productivity went up about 25%. So we were getting 125% of pre-trial output with people working only 4 days. Now, subsequently, we've also seen that things like sick days have halved,
Mm.
and it's made the company far, far more resilient,
Hmm.
which has obviously helped us as we've gone through COVID.
Sure. Yeah. And so what kind of feedback did you get? What were your employees' initial reactions to this 4-day trial?
When we announced it, everybody was sitting there saying, "What's the catch?" Because
Sure.
I think a lot of times when you hear 4 days, I think it's why Christine, my HR director, was so concerned about it. They hear that they're going to work less and be paid less.
Sure.
So that's problem number one. Problem number two is they then say, "Well, how can I do my work in 4 days rather than five? I'm as busy as can be.
Mhm.
It's impossible for me to do it in 4 days." And then you have external stakeholders. I had a private capital firm invested in the company. I had independent directors. Now, those people are people like me. They've all been conditioned that working longer is
Mhm.
working harder. It's
Mhm.
not about working smarter. And so every single group had concerns.
Sure.
The advantage I did is I announced the trial on national television. So that sorted out my private capital partners and my independent directors because none of them were
Mhm.
game enough, having had it announced
Sure.
on
Yeah.
national television to
Yep.
pull the trial.
Yep.
But the trial, we did the trial to be a safe space so that we could prove to everybody that it worked. And obviously it did work, and we needed that data, we needed that experience to be able to convince everybody that we
Yeah.
had something here and it was more than just a whim.
And certainly going on national television speaks to your level of commitment to what you're implementing. So what happened at the end of the trial? What did you guys do when you had your data, had your results? What happened at the end?
Well, at the end of the trial, we actually went back to 5 days a week for a little while. And we did that because we wanted to digest the data and we wanted to tweak the model. When we did the trial, what we did is we actually literally said to everybody, "You will take a day off a week." And that's a different day. We're a retail business. We can't close our offices.
Mhm.
We have
Mhm.
17 offices around New Zealand. But when we re-implemented it, we changed a few things. First of all, we said effectively you can take a day, but you can take 2 half days, or indeed you can come in late and go home early.
Hmm.
So we made the time off relevant to each individual in the company. You work out what it is within the operational constraints, what it is you need to make your life better, to be the best that you can be in the office and the best that you can be at home. We also had to tweak a few things to get around employment legislation in New Zealand
Mm.
because I think a lot of employment legislation globally is focused on the time spent. Again,
Mhm.
it's not focused on output. And quite often it specifies normal hours of work, normal days of work. And that model doesn't fit
Mm.
what we were trying to do.
And I love that idea of flexibility. We had another guest on, Perry Timms, who's the author of Transformational HR, and his entire office takes off every Wednesday because they can. They're not in a retail or manufacturing environment where they need to be up all the time. And so he says every Wednesday, everybody's off. We're working a 4-day work week. So I love the idea of flexibility and looking at different options to make this work.
Well, I think it's critical because what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. And what
Hmm.
we're really trying to talk about, and again, it comes back to the 100-80-100 model. 4-day week is clickbait.
Hmm.
Everybody, I'd be a very rich man if for all the interviews we've done, if I got $1 for every time somebody said, what would it be like to have a 3-day weekend?
Uh,
That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is reducing the amount of time you spend in the office. The overwork pandemic, which was the pandemic before the pandemic,
hmm.
that we are seeing, and you alluded to, the sort of hours that people are working in the
Hmm.
United States. It's
Hmm.
trying to bring that down.
For sure. All right, Andrew, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. But when I come back, I want to dig into the benefits and processes of initiating a 4-day work week. So stay with us.
So, you've provided your supervisors with the training they need to create a positive environment and keep your company union-free. But can they put that knowledge into action? Wise Words e-learning will teach your supervisors how to respond appropriately to tough employee questions about unions, including questions about dues, collective bargaining, promises, and more. Based on solid adult learning theory, Wise Words guides supervisors, helping them practice their skills in a fun and engaging format that sticks with them over time. Wise Words e-learning is delivered in microbursts of learning and is available online 24/7. Your leaders can practice their skills anytime and anywhere there's an internet connection on any device. Wise Words training will protect your company from ULP charges and give your leaders the confidence to connect with employees. Learn more and sign up for a demo at projectionsinc.com today.
And I'm back with Andrew Barnes, architect for 4-Day Week Global. Andrew, let's talk about productivity. Can workers be as productive working a 32-hour work week as they were working 40 hours?
I think they can be more productive. That seems to be the evidence.
Hmm.
So, since we initiated the trial in 2018, thousands of companies around the world have either adopted it themselves. Quite a lot of times they've come to us to draw on the experience that we had. And obviously we've published things like the book and the white paper to help companies do this. On
Mm-hmm.
average, what you're seeing is an improvement in overall productivity between 25 and 50%. So, for example, when Microsoft Japan trialed it, they got 39.9% improvement. But if you look around the world, doesn't matter what the industry is, you will see that generally people produce more because if they're rested, healthy, happy, more engaged,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going out on a limb here, you actually, if you've got a more enthusiastic workforce, you get better outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's absolutely clear now, probably wasn't 3 years ago, but it's clear now that you do produce more by working smarter, not longer.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier that, you saw a reduction in the number of sick days, people taking mental health days, that sort of thing. That might be one metric that we could use. But during your trial, what productivity measures did you use to decide whether this was actually working?
Well, this is an interesting one because quite often people do say to me, Andrew, how did you measure productivity?
Mm-hmm.
And the question being, of course, is, well, how do we measure productivity? And actually, that's the point. It's one
Mm-hmm.
of the reasons I initiated this experiment in the first place. Because you know what? I wasn't measuring productivity. I was using time as a surrogate. I knew what my outputs were, my profits or my revenues. But if you actually asked me what was actually happening at the individual level, I would have had no idea. So what we did is we sat down with the team and we said, look, how should we measure you? How do we prove that output is being maintained? And why that's relevant is that what that meant is that the staff looked at what they were doing and said, actually, you know what? Half the time, the things that I'm doing are just being busy. They're
Mm-hmm.
not actually producing things. Or the way I work means that I'm not being as efficient as possible. Statistically, you'll get interrupted once every 11 minutes in an open plan office, and it'll take you 22 minutes to get back to full productivity.
Mhm.
So if you can change those sort of things very quickly, what you're doing is you're reducing the unproductive time. And so the trade-off that we're talking about here is a reduction in the number of hours, but that is matched by an increase in the amount of time when staff are being productive rather than being busy or indeed surfing the internet and things like that.
Pretending to be busy, right?
Pretending to be busy. We found that, because we checked this, that surfing on the top 5 non-business related internet sites dropped 35% as a consequence of implementing the 4-day week.
Well, and of course, as corporate leaders, that's what we care about. We want to maintain productivity, even if we're going to implement these sort of things. But what impact on the other side? What did this short work week have on like the work-life balance and the morale of the employees?
Well, it had an incredible impact. We know that from the scores that we got back on work-life balance. But actually, the biggest things I took from this was actually the individual stories that people started to feed back. Dads being able to pick their kids up from school for the first time. I have a grandfather who, spends a couple of afternoons a week with his granddaughter. And when he talks about doing that, he cries. Now, that's actually important, right? Because what we're saying is we are giving you something that is so valuable that you can't put a price on it, but more importantly, you will not do anything to prejudice that gift. And that's very much at the heart of our program. We gift our 40 days off a year effectively in return for making sure that productivity doesn't drop. And it's we tweaked this, and this is one of the things that we changed after the trial. It's an annual opt-in, personal opt-in to the 4-day week productivity policy, and it's done deliberately at an individual level because it's a compact between me and each person in the organization. I will gift you all that additional time off. In return, I need to make sure that productivity and customer service standards are absolutely maintained.
And so that was going to be my next question about customer service standards. Was there any feedback from your clients on this 4-day work week idea?
Well, from ours, actually, no. In general terms, what we found is we got a very, very positive response. In fact, we won business. We do know that, there are some companies that have introduced it. And, big clients, specifically because they hate the concept that you're taking the Friday off, would religiously phone up on the Friday to try and say, and then phone the boss and say, I can't get hold of my account manager. And often that takes a little bit of finessing. You have to educate your clients that actually, the service is going to be there. Now, in our case, it's a bit easier because we don't close. We effectively change the composition of how the teams operated so that you can always be serviced anytime we're open, from Monday to Friday. Interestingly, there are some companies that have gone to a 7-day week model because people have said, look, hey, I'd like to work Saturday, Sunday as part of my 4 days. And there's an accounting firm in Western Australia that has taken that model. So in fact, its customer service standards have actually gone up because now you can phone them 7 days a week and get serviced.
So obviously that's a challenge inherent in making this shift. What other challenges did you find?
Well, the big one is legislative, because legislation actually precludes you from doing this sort of flexibility. We had to maneuver around a law that said there is a defined start time and a defined finish time. There is a defined days of work. And of course, if you are taking a different day off a week, which is our model, because not everybody, it's unfair if one person always takes a Friday and somebody else only ever gets a Wednesday. So those days rotate in our system, sorted by the teams. I should say. They're not dealt with by management. That means it falls foul of employment legislation, and that's why you have to opt in. And we don't change our employment contracts. They still say, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. But what we have is this policy that says we'll give you this gift of time off if productivity is maintained, but it sits on top of the existing contract, and that makes it a little bit easier. But so that's really one of the big ones, and obviously continually managing the board, who really struggled. I mean, they were gentlemen of a certain age, and they had, this was not something that they'd experienced before.
Sure. And the success you found adopting it in your own business full time, is that what prompted you and your wife Charlotte to start 4-Day Week Global?
Yeah, it was. What happened was that we announced the trial, and we got an awful lot of publicity. And then when we announced the results, it absolutely exploded. We were the second most read story in the New York Times after the Trump-Putin summit.
Oh, wow.
And it was thousands upon thousands of articles. I think 98 countries around the world have run the story. So what happened then was people kept picking up the telephone, and we'd made a call right from the get-go that actually, this was a little bit bigger than just our own company. And so we had a policy of putting up on our website everything that we'd experienced so we could share it, because we saw that there was interest. Then, of course, what happens is it gets to the point that these calls are coming thick and fast, and we realized that actually there was a desire amongst business leaders all around the world to work out how they would do things differently. And so what we needed to do was put a structure in place that stopped the company being disrupted, and really where we focused most of our time on supporting other companies, other businesses, and lobbying governments to come up with a different way of working, more suited to the 21st century.
Yeah, it seems like it grew a life of its own as people took interest.
It did. The only people not working a 4-day week is Charlotte and I think.
And that makes sense. That's usually how it goes. Andrew, I'm going to take some quick time out for another break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is Andrew Barnes, architect for 4-Day Week Global. We are back. So, Andrew, 4-Day Week Global published a comprehensive white paper on the trial at Perpetual Guardian, and it includes a ton of resources on how-to recommendations, a trial toolbox, case studies, and it makes an amazing case for the adoption of the 4-Day week. So how hard is it to change hearts and minds on this topic?
Staff-wise, I have to say, Jen, not that hard.
Sure.
All the surveys indicate that staff want this. I mean, broadly, about 80% of employees say that they need more time. Very hard with the leadership team. The leadership team is worried that if they implement this, they will be held accountable if productivity drops. So you have to find a way to change that process, to change their mindset so they don't get concerned, that they're going to be held accountable if this thing goes wrong. And the same applies to the board. So you've got to speak in the language of business, and that's very much what I do. A lot of people will talk work-life balance. I don't. I speak about the productivity side and the drivers. Work-life balance comes with it, but this is a very sensible and rational business strategy. And once you explain to people that this is giving you better productivity, it's giving you lower staff turnover, it's enabling you to attract better employees, and also it's seeing reductions in things like sick days. The net result of that is something that business leaders can easily understand, and that makes it safe to give this a go.
So do you think the pandemic and the disruption it caused has made employers more open to this idea of reducing the work week?
Yeah, I think it has, because I think what COVID did, it jog back a bit. The biggest issues people had with the 4-day week was, how do I measure productivity, and can I trust my employees to deliver that if they're working less? And then along came COVID, and suddenly we're all sitting from home. Now, once I'm at home, I can't measure output on time the way I used to. So I had to find a way, or companies had to find a way to measure that productivity, which they did. And they found, amazingly, generally it went up. And then they found that they could trust their employees. So the two big barriers to the 4-day week went. Now, if you add on top of that, suddenly people going, actually, I do want to work from home, or I'm not prepared to go back into the office. The great resignation you're seeing in the US, I think, 4.5 million people in November alone. Suddenly there's been a power shift. That actually you've got to start engaging with your employees as to how the business is going to work going forward. And you can't just dictate, employment terms the way you used to do. So I think COVID has absolutely accelerated this. And I think that's why you're seeing things like, Mark Takano and now I think 100 progressives in Congress and Senate, putting forward a reduced hours work week bill.
For sure. And I think one thing that I was thinking about as you're talking is that, the impact of the pandemic was more than just, keeping people at home. There was also an impact on things like traffic and, on just basically global warming, all those sort of things that they showed animals that came out that hadn't, if this is adopted on a larger scale, what kind of impact do you think it could have?
Oh, it's absolutely material. I mean, something like 17% of US emissions come from commuting to work. So, you make a sizable dent in that if you don't go into the office. And I think UC Davis had a piece of research said the most environmentally friendly thing you can do is not go into the office. But also, it impacts on health. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of the workforce has a stress or mental health issue. If you give time for decompress, if you allow people to work 2 days, take a break 2 days, actually that really does impact that. And that's, data we're seeing in companies in implementing the 4-day week are seeing, as I said before, material reductions in sick days. So you get health benefits, you get infrastructure benefits. It means also you've got more time to spend with your family. That goes to education, goes to family cohesion.
Sure.
So there are lots and lots and lots of great things that accrue simply when you give people more time to do the things in their lives. I mean, after all, Charlotte often says, we borrow our people from our lives. What we're doing here is giving them a little bit of it back.
I love that. So we've talked in depth about the trial and how it went for you. Since then, I'm sure you have seen a number of other case studies. Do you want to share a little bit about any other companies that you've seen this implemented and how that went?
Yeah, well, broadly, it's almost take your pick. But I think one of the big things about this is that people often say to us, it wouldn't work in this industry, it wouldn't work in that industry, it'll work in yours, you're office-based. So, big examples, Volkswagen, car manufacturing is on a 4-day week. Now, we can criticize the Germans for many things, but productivity isn't one of them, right? So one of the most productive manufacturing companies in the world is operating on a 4-day week.
Interesting.
You will have seen in the United States, that Bolt has just announced that it's doing it. Now, there's a technology startup that has seen material benefits in, both productivity and output. We've got building companies here in New Zealand that have gone on that. Obviously, there are lots of office-based companies that do it. Statistically, as I said, it's generally 25 to 50% improvement in productivity. But I saw a really interesting statistic the other day from a company that said that the number of applicants that it
Mm.
had gone up 280%.
I don't doubt that. That makes perfect sense to me.
Now, that's a really interesting point in the context of everybody struggling now to find high quality employees.
Mm-hmm.
And again, an interesting one. Another company called me and said that, look, we've always been at the forefront of having good conditions for our employees, and so we had flexible working, we had home working, and then they've had to come back and said, that's no longer good enough. We're going to have to do a 4-day week because that's going to take us to the next level. People, if we want to be at the cutting edge, we have to be changing that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're now implementing a 4-day week. That's a UK gaming, electronic gaming company.
Mm.
So they're going to do it because they need to try and attract and retain the very best talent. So, you can't compete with the likes of a Google or an Apple on money often. What you can do is compete in terms of employment conditions. And I think in those industries where things are very tight, you're starting to see that.
Interesting. So if I want to learn more about 4-Day Week Global, where can I go?
Well, obviously, first of all, go to the website, 4dayweek.com. That's number one. Number two is read my book. I wrote it quite simply because I just couldn't drink that much coffee with people. So it's a very practical how-to book.
Yeah.
We use the profits from that to help fund our global research. And what we're doing through 4-Day Week Global now is we are running a series of pilots. So we're running one in the United States, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Israel. And what we're doing there is we're getting a bunch of companies together. We're giving them mentoring from organizations that have already done it. We're giving them some briefings on how we did it. And that means that a group of companies can move forward over a 3 to 6 month period together, sharing their experiences of how it's going, what are the problems, what are the benefits. And that creates a little bit of safety in numbers because we're still at that point where this is a little bit on the edge, albeit I think Forbes wrote last week that maybe the tipping point has started to come. Panasonic last week announced that they were shifting to, a 4-day week. We're starting to get these large companies, Unilever is trialing it, looking at whether, in fact, this is the model for the future. And I'm absolutely convinced that, of course, it is.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that that's actually catching on. I want to let everyone know that the links will be included in this episode's companion guide, everything that Andrew spoke about, and a link to download 4-Day Week's global white paper will also be there. So be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Andrew, it is time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions I like to ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right. So our first question is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about the 4-Day Week. So, Andrew, which of these quotes speaks to the 4-Day Week cause best? It's not the hours you put in your work that counts. It's the work you put in the hours. Or be stubborn about your goals and flexible about your methods.
Well, actually, I would add a different one. Is life shit because Arsenal are shit, or the other way around?
Okay, there you go. Spoken like a true believer. All right, Andrew.
Which is true.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Andrew, next question is, what is the best book that you've read recently?
Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One Click America by Alec McGillis.
And what's your favorite thing about the work that you do?
Oh, look, it's the variety. You don't get many chances to change the world. This is such a fantastic opportunity to talk to people and meet people all around the world.
So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Very trite, but I have to say it is still stop and smell the roses. This is about appreciating that your life isn't just your work.
And that's in keeping with the work that you do. So that makes perfect sense. Finally, last question, who or what inspires you?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Sir Ernest Shackleton. Primarily because I still think he's one of the great leaders of people of all time, and actually somebody who cared deeply to make sure that actually he kept his people safe, even though it meant, sacrificing the big audacious goal that he was personally chasing.
Yeah, that's food for thought for sure. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to have a cup of coffee with me today. So I know you can't drink that much coffee, but I'm glad that we had this time. I just want to thank you for being on today's episode of Project HR.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, feel free to email us, projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last, but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.